Slavery did not begin in America. It did not begin with Europe, and it did not belong to any single race. Long before the Atlantic slave trade, human beings were already enslaving other human beings across Africa, the Middle East, Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Empires rose on it. Religions regulated it. Entire civilizations normalized it. Yet today, when we talk about slavery, our history is often reduced to a single, specific chapter. This documentary does not deny that chapter. It expands the lens, because history can't be understood by looking at only one part of it. To understand slavery, we have to confront its full, global, past uncomfortable, complex, and deeply human. The earliest written evidence of slavery appears in ancient Mesopotamia, more than 4,000 years ago. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest deciphered legal texts, didn't question slavery. It organized it. Slaves were prisoners of war, people who fell into debt, or criminals. They were bought, sold, punished, and inherited just like any other piece of property. In ancient Egypt, the same civilization that built the pyramids, slavery existed alongside monumental power. Prisoners captured during military campaigns were forced into hard labor in mines, on farms, in construction, and as domestic servants. Slavery was visible, it was accepted, and it was institutional. Ancient Greece, the civilization we often remember for philosophy and the birth of democracy, depended heavily on enslaved labor. The city-state of Athens could function only because slaves worked its silver mines, its farms, and its households. Citizenship and freedom for some existed only because others were owned. The Roman Empire then took slavery and expanded it to an unprecedented, almost industrial, scale. At certain points in its history, slaves made up nearly a third of the entire population. They were captured from all corners of the empire, from Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia. Roman law was brutally clear. Slaves were property, nothing more. Any form of rebellion was met with terrifying force, like mass executions, designed to spread fear and maintain control. For thousands of years, slavery was global long before it was racial. Across the continent of Africa, slavery existed in many different forms, long before the first European ships arrived. Many African societies practiced domestic slavery, where captives were integrated into families and households over time. Other kingdoms operated complex and far-reaching slave markets, connected to the Trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean trade routes. Powerful empires like Ghana, Mali, Songhai, Dahomey, and the Ashanti captured and sold enslaved people, who were often prisoners of war from rival groups. Now, these systems were still brutal, but they were different in their structure from what would come later. In some of these societies, an enslaved individual could sometimes marry, own property, or even gain their freedom within a generation or two. This doesn't make that form of slavery moral. It just makes it historically distinct. At the same time, the Arab and Islamic slave trade, which began in the 7th century, stretched across Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, and even parts of Europe. Over more than 1,000 years, millions of people were enslaved. Men were used as laborers and soldiers. Women were often forced into domestic service and concubinage. The practice of castration was common for male slaves, a cruel act that erased entire generations. This trade route lasted longer than the Atlantic slave trade, yet it is rarely discussed with the same intensity in the West. And in Europe itself, slavery didn't just disappear after the fall of Rome. It existed well into the Middle Ages. The Vikings were notorious slave traders, capturing people from across northern Europe and selling them in markets as far as the Mediterranean and the Middle East. In fact, Slavic peoples from Eastern Europe were enslaved so frequently that their name became the root of the word we use today. And in the Americas, many native societies practiced their own forms of slavery long before European contact. Captives taken during warfare were forced into labor, used in rituals, or held in permanent subjugation. These systems varied widely from tribe to tribe, but they were real. The point is, slavery was not invented by one civilization. It was practiced by many. Then came the Atlantic slave trade. History changed forever. From the 15th to the 19th centuries, European powers transformed slavery. They turned it into an industrial, global economic system. Millions of Africans were captured, sold by other Africans and Europeans, and then transported across the ocean under conditions so brutal that millions died before even reaching land. But this system was different in several critical ways. First, slavery became permanent and hereditary. If your mother was a slave, you were born a slave. Your children would be slaves. Freedom became nearly impossible to achieve. Second, and most importantly, it became racial. For the first time in history, the color of a person's skin blackness itself was used as the justification for their enslavement. This ideology was created to make an economic system seem like a natural order. Violence against enslaved people wasn't just common, it was legally protected. Over 4 centuries, more than 12 million Africans were forced onto ships and transported across the Atlantic. But here is a fact that surprises many people. Fewer than 5% of them were sent to what would eventually become the United States. The vast majority, over 95%, were shipped to Brazil and the islands of the Caribbean. The sugar plantations there were so deadly that they consumed human lives at a staggering rate. Brazil alone imported more enslaved Africans than all of British North America combined. So why does the American narrative of slavery dominate the global memory? There are a few reasons. First, the United States survived as a nation, became a global superpower, and has since shaped modern media, education, and culture around the world. Its story, told in its language, became the one most people heard. Second, the history of slavery in the US remains unresolved, a raw and deeply political issue that continues to drive public conversation. But when one story becomes the only story, our understanding of history becomes incomplete. This leads to some important questions. Why did slavery exist almost everywhere? Why did so many different societies accept it as normal? Why did some slave systems end earlier than others? And who benefits from forgetting the rest of the story? Selective memory is a powerful tool. It protects national pride. It simplifies complex morality into a simple story of good guys and bad guys. And most conveniently, it avoids the uncomfortable truth of a shared human responsibility. Slavery was not an accident of history. It was a human system, created and maintained by human beings for profit and power. Understanding that doesn't excuse it. It explains Italiano. It forces us to look at the economic and social incentives that made it possible. History is not clean, and it is never simple. If we reduce the vast, global history of slavery to a single chapter, we don't just lose the truth, we lose the warning that comes with it. Slavery as a legal institution was abolished, but the practice of exploitation was not. The system changed its name, but the incentives to exploit vulnerable people for profit remained. To truly understand our present, we must confront the full past, not the version that's easiest to teach, but the one that is hardest to face. Because history doesn't disappear when we choose to ignore it. It waits, and eventually, it repeats. Thanks for watching. If you found this perspective valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more deep dives into complex history.